Hi everyone, it's Kathy, and today I'll be sharing two cards that I created using the newly released burst background stamp from Whimsy Stamps, along with a bunch of previously released products from Whimsy Stamps, the Wonky stitched rectangles, the Happy Sky stamp set, Happy Everything stamp set, and the polka dot stencil. So the first thing I did was grabbed my misti and I took the foam pad out because the burst background stamp is a cling mounted stamp. And the protective backing sheet, I do keep those just to keep the back of my stamp nice and clean so it does stick to the lid of my misti. And for this particular card, I wanted to have the background be offset a little bit. So the first thing I did was I put some temporary adhesive on the back of my card panel, which is Neenah Classic Crest cardstock, and it does measure 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, and I will be trimming that down as I usually do, although I end up trimming this one a lot more than I wanted to, but we'll get to that later. I placed it on top of the stamp where I wanted the image to be, and then I closed the back of the misti and then flipped it over and pressed it down so that the temporary adhesive would hold the cardstock in place on the base of my misti. Next, I inked up my stamp really well with a VersaMark ink so I could do some heat embossing. I coated my cardstock with clear embossing powder, and then I used my heat tool to set it until it was nice and melted. I had my heat tool heating up off to the side there. I had actually turned it on right before I started inking up the stamp to make sure that it was nice and hot to try and reduce some of the warping that you get when you heat set cardstock. And it helped a little bit, but I'm going to add some ink and I'm going to add some water so my cardstock's going to get warped anyway. So moving right along, I'm going to do some ink blending with the rainbow of colors in Distress Oxide inks. I started out with mustard seed, and with an ink blending brush, I just did a very, very light coat. I'm actually kind of flicking the brush a little bit, and then I go over it in that circular motion just to get the ink to blend a little bit. I'm not too worried about getting a perfect blend. Right now, all I want to do is add a little bit of color. So after the mustard seed, I moved on to carved pumpkin, and then what's that color? Picked raspberry. And again, a very, very light hand. After the picked raspberry, I moved on to the twisted citron, and I did the twisted citron on both the left and the right side, but I didn't go across the center because I know that I'm going to cover the center up with my sentiment, and there was no point in using any extra ink if I didn't have to. Then I came in with the peacock feathers, and I did blend that on the left side and the right side because I knew that when I brought in that purple, that the purple and the twisted citron probably wouldn't play well together. So I knew that by having the peacock feathers on either side when I brought in the wilted violet, it would blend a lot easier. Once I was done with all of the ink blending, I used a clean paper towel just to buff off that embossing ink so that the embossing powder, so that the white would shine through and that background stamp would really stand out a lot more. I wanted to add a little bit more texture to that background, so I grabbed the polka dot stencil and used some painter's tape to hold it in place. When I did the ink blending over the stencil, I did use a much heavier hand because I did want those polka dots to show up quite a bit. Once I was done with the stenciling, I did use a clean paper towel again just to buff off the embossing powder a second time. Again, just to make sure that the bright white shows through. And of course, I had to grab my Distress sprayer and add some water droplets. And I was trying to be fancy and get big droplets and little droplets. So that's why I keep coming in with it, because I'm not pulling the trigger all the way back. I'm just doing it a little bit just to get the bigger drops. And then I put a paper towel up on top of that to soak up some of the excess water. And I set that panel aside to dry. Next, I stamped my sentiment, and the sentiment is from the Happy Everything set, and I wanted it to fit within a circle. So I grabbed both of the sentiments and I lined them up inside the circle die. Then I removed the die and closed the lid to my misti and picked up both stamps. Now, I really wanted to have my sentiments be really close together, so I did remove the birthday stamp and only stamped the word happy. I used VersaFine Onyx Black ink to stamp the sentiments because I did want them to be nice and bold against that background. And after I stamped the word happy, I took that out of my misti and lined up birthday, and I was able to scooch it up just a little bit more so that they would be stacked closer together. I ran that through my die cut machine with a circle die, and then I also cut a piece of black cardstock with a circle die that's just slightly larger. And then it was time to finish up the card. And I had mentioned earlier about cutting down the panel to fit the front of my card, and what I should have done in the very beginning was die cut it with a stitched rectangle die. But I tried to use my paper trimmer, and because the paper was warped, I couldn't get it to cut straight. So eventually I got smart and just ran it through my die cut machine with the Wonky stitched rectangle die and adhered that to the front of a piece of black cardstock that is cut just slightly larger. I adhered that to the front of a top folding A2 size note card, and my card base is also 80-pound Neenah Classic Crest cardstock. And I used my tape runner to adhere the sentiment in place, and that finishes up my first card. For my second card, since I had so much ink left on this stencil, I thought I could put that to good use, but I did want to add a little bit of the twisted citron in the center where I skipped going over it on the first card so that it would be a full line all the way across. So I just dabbed a little bit with my ink blending brush. Then I spritzed the stencil with some water and I flipped it over onto a piece of Neenah Classic Crest cardstock, which is cut to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. And again, I'll trim that one down too. I used a paper towel just to rub over the back side of that stencil to get the ink to transfer onto the cardstock. And I set that aside to dry before I placed it on top of the stamp in my misti, just to make sure that I didn't get a muddy mess when I actually went to stamp the image. And I did the same thing. I placed the cardstock on top of the stamp and put a little bit of removable adhesive and then flipped the back of the misti over so that the cardstock would be right where I wanted it to be when I did my stamping. I used the same color Distress Oxide inks, and I did this in sections. So I inked up the top with the picked raspberry and stamped it down, and then I came in with the carved pumpkin and inked up the stamp. And then I dabbed it off a little bit with my grimy little rag there just to make sure that the carved pumpkin stamped on top of the carved pumpkin from the ink transfer from the stencil. But I'm not cleaning my stamp as I go because I want to be able to see where I left off with the previous color. Once I was done stamping the background, I set that panel aside and I started coloring in the images from the Happy Sky stamp set. I stamped them onto a piece of Cougar Super Smooth cardstock with my favorite things Extreme Black Hybrid ink, and then just jumped right in with the Copic coloring. The coloring I did was pretty simple. The images, the hot air balloons are a good size. The little animals are pretty small, so I didn't worry too much about getting a whole lot of contrast with those little guys because they're pretty tiny. But for the balloons, I did want to make sure that I had a really nice center highlight down the front so that it would look like it was, well, ballooning out, being that it's a hot air balloon. I'll make sure to have all of the products that I used listed in the description box below, as well as all of the Copic colors that I used. For this hot air balloon, I started out with YR16 and I flicked from the top of the balloon down and from the bottom of the balloon up. Then I came in with YR14 and extended the YR16 just a little bit, making sure to leave a pretty good white highlight right smack in the center. Then I came in with the YR12 and finished coloring that in and then moved on to the other stripes. For the yellow stripes, I used Y08, Y13, and Y11, and I did the same technique. I started with my darkest color and came down from the top of the balloon towards the center, and then from the bottom of the balloon up towards the center, and then just blend it out with the other two colors. For the basket, I used YR27, YR23, and YR21. And again, because the basket is also a round object, I wanted to maintain a nice center highlight for that. So I started with the YR27 on either side and then flicked towards the center and then blended that out with the YR23 and finished up with the YR21. For the hot air balloon with the giraffe, I did the exact same technique. I just used different colors for the balloon. And again, I'll make sure to have those colors listed in the description box below. For the giraffe, again, because he's very little, I only used two colors, YR24 and YR21. And I concentrated the YR24 like at the bottom of his chin and then down his neck underneath his chin. And then I colored the rest of the giraffe in with the YR21. Once I was done with the coloring, I set those guys aside and I grabbed a piece of scrap black cardstock to stamp my sentiment, which reads, "Make Today Spectacular." And here's a little tip for you. I inked it up with VersaMark ink because I wanted to do some embossing with white embossing powder. And when I closed the misti door, I barely pressed down because the words "make today" are really, really very fine. And if you press down too hard, you'll kind of get the ink to squish out and then it won't be so crisp and clear. So with really light pressure, those sentiments, even as small and fine as they are, they came out really, really clear. Anyway, after I had the embossing powder heat set, I did trim that down with my paper trimmer a little bit. And then I cut off the edge at an angle with my scissors. And then it was time to put my card together. The background panel ended up being really very warped, so in order to make sure that it had a chance to flatten out, I decided to use liquid glue to adhere that to a piece of black cardstock. And the background panel, I did run that through my Gemini Junior with a Wonky stitched rectangle as well. And then the black cardstock, I just trimmed that down so it would be a very small border. Anyway, after I had put the glue on the back of that, I set it up and with an acrylic block on top of it just to flatten it out a little bit more. And while the glue had a chance to set a little bit, I put a whole bunch of foam tape on all of my other bits and pieces for the front of the card. And I did run those through my Gemini Junior with the coordinating dies as well. I removed the release paper from the foam tape and I put them on the front of the card, but I didn't press them down totally because I'm going to fiddle and fuss with the placement of these little bits and pieces. I kept thinking the balloons needed to be closer together, and then I thought, no, they're too close together, and I finally decided on placement and pressed everything down. And then I noticed that I didn't get good coverage with the embossing powder on the R in the word spectacular. So I just used a 0.05 white gel pen to clean that up just a little bit. And then the final step was to add a little bit of shimmer to the clouds with my Wink of Stella glitter pen. And that finishes up my second card. Thank you so much for joining me. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, I'd love it if you would. And don't forget to ring the bell so you're notified every time a new video is posted. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.